Okay, alrighty, lads. Today we are talking improving a D&D session. Much like autism, improving of a session is a spectrum. If you have everything written out, you have scripted out every single line of dialogue, and you have 10 pages of notes written, you still have to improv at least a little bit every time a player takes an action and either succeeds or fails, because you can never, unless you have like 1.4 million pages written where you have determined how every single success of every roll will lead into one another. You're still gonna have to determine. You're still gonna have to improv as you narrate a hit or a miss on a creature. And to the other extreme, if you've nothing written, entirely going off the top of your head, you're improving everything. You still have at least a little bit prepared in that you either have the context of the players, their characters, or what they're working off of, or the past like previous sessions, and or you're influenced by media you've consumed and like things that you were aware of that could conceivably happen that might be fun. So in either direction, you're improving at least a little bit. So my attempt here is to strike the perfect balance between improving as much of a session as possible while preparing as little as I possibly can. Okay, so there is a classic age-old adage among DMs that you are not writing a novel and making your players just characters in that novel. We are playing a cooperative storytelling game. And to that effect, you need to let your players have as much of an influence as you can like possibly get away with in this story. Like it should be entirely directed by them, like along every point. Everything should be a result of like the players and their actions. And early on, I think I heard this pretty early in my DMing career, but I don't think I truly like grokked it, truly understood it until recently. Like you will, or at least when I heard this advice, you're not writing a novel and having your players be characters in it. I took that more literally to mean, or I understood it as like, well, or I was able to convince myself I don't have 200 pages of notes written or anything. I obviously don't have a literal novel written, therefore, I'm not doing this. Yeah, I might have the ending of the campaign thought out. Like, I know what the final climatic battle is going to be. And I know what kind of events are going to lead up into that. And I might also know where the next couple of sessions are generally going to go. But that's all like outlined stuff. That's not like having a novel written. And but this is obviously like hyperbolic advice. What it really means is like don't have too much prepared, because the more you have prepared, the more you are going to like influence the characters and their actions to go along with what you have written and the direction you want the story to go in, where ideally you should have the story as like open as possible so that your players can really have as much of an influence over it as they like humanly can. And so when you prepare too much, either one of two things is going to happen. Like if you have your binder full of content, or if the players turn right at the road, they will either uh, turn right and go along with everything that you have written and all the events that you had like decided that we're going to transpire will do so, will be, um in which case like the players aren't really telling the story, you are telling the story to the players. Or they turn left at the road and now your binder full of content. Well, you're either going to decide, okay, well, all this stuff just happened on the left side of the road instead. And in which case, then, the players never had any real choice to begin with. Everything has just been an illusion. And horseshoe theory wrap back around to them never having any agency because all these events were just going to happen one way or another. Or they turn left and you decide to throw out the binder and all that preparation is effectively wasted. What I'm trying to get at is like, yeah, the more you have prepared, the the less your players are telling a story, basically. So ideally, in order to have them tell as much of a story as possible, you want to write as little ahead as possible. And another problem that I think that I've personally had like a lot of or that I've been doing within my campaign up until this point is I would write just the next session so that my players, I would always let them influence what was going to happen in the next session. But once that session started, I already had plot point a like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that was going to happen over the course of that session. And I was basically going to try my hardest to hit all 8 of those points, uh, regardless of what my players actively did during that session. And I think this causes a problem in that, I've played in many a campaign that was along this line as well, where like, the DM doesn't have the next session prepared, so your actions this session will sort of determine what happens next session. And I find this kind of like puts you in a headspace, at least if you are a player playing from like a dramatic storytelling perspective and you're thinking about what kind of things can I do to have an effect on this story and make it interesting. You're more so going to be in a headspace of thinking about the future because this session is effectively set in stone. Like you guys said last session, we're going to the orc camp. So this session, we are going to the orc camp, and that's going to be what it is. And now what I'm thinking about is like, okay, well, what can I do during this session to set up next session? But I generally want people to be in the headspace of the present. Like I want people to think about like, what can I do now to have an effect on the rest of this session, rather about like that sort of meta aspect of like thinking about the next session already and not thinking about the here and now. And okay, so the solution to these problems is, improving more. And so how do I improv a session? Well, really by doing a lot of prep work, which seems like counterintuitive and or maybe not just counterintuitive, but like entirely counter to the entire point of improving. But what I'm trying to do is just create like a master list of story beats or encounters or such that could conceivably occur in any session or at any point in my campaign, and then choosing the ones that are the most appropriate for the context of this session and the players that are currently at my table. And okay, so I talked about that previous problem that I solved. That is a really artsy fartsy, abstract, everyone's their own worst critic type problem. I don't think most players are thinking in those sort of terms at any point uh, in as they're playing. Like I don't think they're concerned about any sort of like in the moment grand narrative storytelling yada yada. But this is like a tangible, real problem that it solves, and that is I want to minimize the amount of advance notice I need for a session. I want to be able to, like, for example, I don't know, like, I assume this is something that other people have a problem with. At least I definitely do in this, like, West Marches style campaign, which I think all of this advice is definitely directed towards, is that sort of West Marches style, as opposed to any sort of like, your Lord of the Rings Fellowship campaign. In that, uh, like, just in the real world, sometimes I will be, hanging out with people just like a day of people find out, oh, hey, actually, I don't have work today, or the thing that I was going to do got canceled. I actually will be around today. Let's hang out. And then, I'll be with some number of people that are all members of my campaign, and we're sitting there hanging out trying to come up with, like, well, what do you guys want to do? I don't know, let's do this, that, or the other. And I can't help but think in my head, like, if I had just known that all these people in my campaign were going to be free today, if I had known just a little bit earlier, I could have been prepared a session. We could be playing D&D right now. um and not to say that I've never tried to, like, improv a session in that circumstance before, but when I've done so in the past, like, a couple of things happen. Like, one, if you entirely, like, I've done entirely off the cuff improv with nothing prepared, and I find that that gets really silly and goofy really fast. Alternatively, um, like, when I have improved a session before with something prepared, I just sort of like had a dungeon and just had people run through the dungeon, which, it was a fun, good time. And I don't think anyone was particularly, like, upset or disappointed or anything with that session, but it didn't meet the standards that I, like, ideally wanted it to reach. Uh, but anyways, like, I'm trying to make a session feel as full and intentional and as much of a real session as possible, while minimizing the amount of time I need to know beforehand. And, because I want to be able to just run sessions the day of. I want to just, like, have people here at my place and just think, like, hey guys, give me like 5 minutes. Let me whip something together, and then we can just get right into, like, a meaningful session of D&D. Okay, so the process. So I have this, like, big master list of, like, encounters that I think could happen, and in my, like, first 5 minutes, I'm I'm just gonna ask, like, give me a few minutes to read my notes, come up with something. I'm going to, like, well, for one, it depends how much time I think we're going to play. If, I think we're only going to have 2 hours, I think, we might be able to take out, like, three, like, meaningful encounters in that time. And so I'll just look over my list and I will mark down, like, a one, two, and a three next to those encounters in an like in a preliminary order that I think it might make sense for them to occur. And um and that, like, order that they're going to occur is sort of going to be my, like, backup plan. Like, if something occurs that, if I'm ever stuck in a session and I'm ever like, I don't know exactly if I can logically or like dramatically branch this thing, or like connect this thing to the next thing. But I need something to occur because all these people are just otherwise sitting here. I'm just gonna move on to the next encounter and just come up with a reason for it to occur, even if it's not logical or dramatic. Um, and ideally, like during the session, over the course of what the players do, I might either pick other events that I didn't mark down because I think they might make more sense in this context, or I will change the order around of the events that I had picked out for myself. Just depending on what the players do and what is the most dramatic, what makes the most sense. So here is my sort of like document I wrote in my general like structure, my general format of how I want to have the order of my improv session go. And now originally I had this sort of like story circle 1 through 8 things that were going to happen. That was a little not as like free formed as I think it was like truly helpful for D&D. I think like so often that sort of order either gets broken up or it doesn't happen in the way that you want it to for a giant variety of reasons, so that it just wasn't worth taking. It wasn't worth like restricting myself to prepping in such a way that it was going to occur in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 method. Okay, so how I am going to start sessions. So in the past, I tried to come up with a sort of personal vignette for each character, either in some way incorporating their downtime or just like giving a quick intro to who they are as a person and like introducing them to everyone else at the table and or the thing that they've been up to. And I just it just took so long. I would spend like literally hours, or usually like an hour, sometimes more, trying to come up with like an interesting scene for each character to partake in before actually launching into the session. And a lot of the time, the characters just want to get through it so that they can get with the rest of the party and then start on the actual adventure. Uh, and so I realized, like, okay, yeah, being like this is probably quite a bit much. So now I just have a single vignette for the like entire party, and the purpose here. So instead of like zooming in on each character and figuring out what they are doing, which you're still doing a bit of with the resolving of downtime, instead we're just going to show the like results of the last session. So you can kind of think about this like a having a post credits scene in like a movie, but at the beginning of the next episode instead of at the like end of the last episode. Um, so you can do a couple of things with this vignette. Well, first of all, you're moving the camera away from the players and you're showing something that they would not have any firsthand knowledge of, or that they like wouldn't directly see, I guess is a better way to put it. And um, so some things you can do with this, you can establish the tone. If you think, there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do this. If you are leading into like a horror session or an investigation session or anything like that, you can give your players like an idea of that being the case with, just what you show with this short vignette. Alternatively, if you want to try to show like the stakes of the like current campaign that they're in, their current arc, Like, are they at like a very bleak outcome sort of part? Like, are we looking at like the heroes at their lowest? They're like, the villain looks like they're gonna win and everything, and we want everything to seem dark and gloomy and bleak. Or have they just like beat the hero, or they've just beat the villain? And I want to have a vignette that shows everything seeming like bright and glorious and hopeful. Um, but the main important thing is showing results from the last session. So if the players just freed a demon over the course of their last session, the vignette might show this demon running around the countryside, going on a rampage or whatever. And just to show every single session that like something you guys are actively doing is having an effect on the world as a greater whole. You could also just use this for, if not like that dramatic world building sense, you can use it just for like comedic effect, as like what that peasant you guys helped to your that peasant you guys helped is up to now that he's alive and with his family, or any direction you want to go with it. And ideally, you can use, you want to try to use this to tie together multiple sessions. And you can use this as sort of like as a part of like a rule of three: your beginning, middle, end, your setup, your reminder, your payoff, as a means of like maybe seeing that demon. I guess there's different ways you can like look at through this lens of setup, reminder, payoff. That might be a setup for this next upcoming session. Maybe at some point, there's a reminder that hey, that demon is about, and then towards the climax of that session, maybe the payoff is that this demon shows up and attacks the players. Alternatively, that could be maybe them setting that demon free last session was the setup. Them seeing them in the vignette is the reminder, and the payoff is it showing up. Alternatively, the vignette of the demon going on a rampage, that could be the payoff for the players, like freeing that demon. Uh, but yeah, so if you can tie things together from session to session. Also, this is sort of like a stand-in for the recap of last week's session, because especially in a West Marches campaign, like might be players present that were not there in the last session, so you can use this as sort of like an in between of like a recap and actual events in the game. And that like you can, the players that were there last session, they'll understand like, oh, okay, this is what's happening. And and then any players that are new that weren't there in that last session, they might be given a reason to like ask that player, like, so wait, what happened last session? Even though one might consider that metagaming. I don't think that would fall under the purview of metagaming at all. I think that's more of just like a social contract. Like you are being given a prompt in this vignette, and now like you asking that player is sort of like the answer to that prompt that you are being handed by the DM. Like this, if you're thinking about it in the improv sense of like being given a gift to work with, that's more so how I would look at it. And you can also use this to like teach the players information. So like if a week passes over the course of the last session to this session, uh instead of saying to the players like, instead of having to have the innkeep walk up to the players and say like, well, that demon that someone freed the last session has been going on a rampage. They might instead, or they might learn that information, or like as a stand-in for that innkeep walking up and telling them this is sort of a method to show don't tell that information to them. Uh, which okay, and going on. So then we're just going to pick up with the party. I might start first with asking people what they want to do before we like meet up and get started. And this is sort of my replacement for having like a personal vignette for each player. And so like if anyone actively wants to go out of their way to have their own vignette and do a thing, then this is their opportunity to do that. Otherwise, no dilly dallying. Like we're just gonna get right into it. And okay, so starting the adventure, I'm gonna hit the players with a hook, and again, well, once they're all together, once they are in the meeting place, the hook is going to be presented to them. I'm not gonna like try to waste time with an awkward sitting around the tavern scene because I find, at least with my players, nothing productive comes from it. It's always, uh, them trying to figure out what the hook is. So I've got like three different types of hooks. The rumor, the word about town. This is sort of, this might be what people consider an inactionable hook, or like in that it doesn't directly present like any immediate action that the players like have to take, or else there's going to be some sort of consequence or something. Um, so I generally will like start with one of these, and sort of just to give the players an option of like, well, look, if you guys don't care about the thing you guys are actively working on or towards, well, there's this big monster hiding out in wherever. And if you guys want to hunt that guy down, here's the innkeep talking about that thing that's going on. And so that's sort of like if they want to bite onto that hook, they can. If they don't, it, doesn't matter. And the next one that I think like usually I'll always have like three hooks ready. I've never had my players not bite onto at least the second hook. Like sometimes I'll throw out the first one, they don't care, and they will say, like, no, we got to work on this thing that we've been doing. And so the second hook, I'll try to make sure connects to that thing that they are doing in some way. And I find the most straightforward way to have the players like bite onto a hook is an NPC needs help, and ideally it is someone that they care about or are close to, is like in need of some sort of help, and says like, hey, can ideally the more drastic you can make it, like I am literally going to die if you guys do not help me with this, and or I've been captured and I need you to rescue me. And generally I've always found that my players will take that and then roll with that. And but alternatively, you can't just spam your damsel is in distress every single session. Sometimes you need to throw in another different hook there. And I always make sure to have that third one as my just in cases. But if someone, makes an offer you can't refuse, I guess generally that might be the evil guy that says like, "Do this for me, or else I'm going to kill you or someone you care about or whatever. I'm going to take something away from you if you do not meet my demand." And alternatively, it might be a good person that says like, "Hey, if you want to make this moral, ethical choice that will help people as a whole, or like generally for the good of mankind or what have you, do this thing." Alternatively, neutral person might say like, "Here's a whole bunch of gold and treasure or what have you, if you do this thing for me." And the hook, if you're gonna be leading into a long session, if you're like, okay, this is going to be like a more than 2 hour session, I would probably have this lead into a dungeon because a dungeon is usually going to take at least 2 hours. Um, if it's just going to be a short session, if it's just going to be like we're just going to run through a couple of encounters, just getting them out of the tavern and onto the road is enough. And because once they're on the road, then you can just start having encounters show up. And so here are my different types of encounters: the travel or the giant quote unquote random encounter. Now, obviously, one of the things you learn very early on in D&D is you never have an actual random encounter. You never have the Final Fantasy. You guys walked in the tall grass and oh, we're swirling in. There's 5 orcs that attack you, and then that be the end of that. Like if the Final Fantasy random encounter is a one-dimensional random encounter, we need at least a two-dimensional random encounter. Those orcs need to have at least be a member of some other greater group, or these orcs need to have been deliberately attacking a specific person or something that the players are going to rescue in this random encounter. Never, you can't just have you know sack of hit points shows up and is waiting for you to uh, get them to zero. There's always got to be some other anything that elevates it out of that. And there's tons of things you can just happen across on the road. They can be hostile combat encounters. It can be a social encounter. This can be a helpful encounter, or it can take away from the players. Um, so with the with the orcs show up, you can either have them tie them in with a faction, which establishes a little bit of like the little bit of world building, the groups and organizations. Alternatively, it might deal with the central tension, which in D&D, 99% of the time is going to be the big bad evil guy. So, tie them in with him to some degree. Or this can be a hook. Maybe they just, they killed a messenger who has a letter on him. And, that letter, the players find it and it leads to something. Okay. Then, instead of just the road encounter, the character encounter. Something that directly ties into either a character's backstory, whether or not it's something that they have literally written down and you are like borrowing from it, or if you are just creating something new that has happened in their backstory that they are going to learn about from this encounter. Something to develop a character a little bit more. And last one, location encounter. This will be like specific to, okay, if they are in these woods, something in this, this a person who lives in these woods type encounter. So you're either going to learn about the world building, learn about the setting, or you're going to reinforce something about the setting. And so here are my sort of examples that I've prepared for my session. So if they are in the hills for whatever reason, if the hook has led them to going through any hills, they might here find this halfling village where they may encounter, or they will encounter, these characters who give them these hooks. And if the players decide to go along with it, they can. If not, so be it. They can just continue with whatever it is they were doing. But giving them the choice is the important part. I've got a couple that aren't tied to any specific place in particular, but they could encounter anywhere, like the flying wizard tower that if I just need something to occur in a place that they're at, uh, it's good to have some of these like free form ones that can just happen anywhere, and just have the characters stumble upon it. And this might lead to something. So my character encounters, so with Cletus, my the main problem with character encounters is that if it's someone new, if there's like an entirely new character that hasn't done like anything yet in the world and doesn't really have any sort of backstory, uh, you know, I can only have these things written for characters that have like done something or like have any sort of backstory as of this point. So you might encounter like a rival or a nemesis or a specific enemy to you and your people, and uh, something along those lines. These I've got like a try to have like a good mix of like both social and combat encounters. The hooks, so these lead into specific dungeons or like outposts, and I've started leaning more towards like this sort of outpost as opposed to a dungeon. Whereas like if my main differentiation of those two is that like a dungeon like room by room by room, each with their own encounter, whereas the outpost is more of like the Far Cry. It's just this big area that just has like 30, 40, 50 dudes in it or whatever, and it's just like up to you guys, the players, to deal with this in some way. And because the dungeon, usually there are like laid out choices. You like, okay, you guys can either walk through the main entrance, or you can take some risk and go through the secret middle entrance, or what have you. Like there's usually like laid out choices that the players are going to choose between. What I like about the outpost is it's like entirely free form. Like if you guys just want to, you might either try to find, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, other people that might work with you against this outpost, or you might just try the head on assault, or like maybe sit in the woods and start crafting siege engines. You hire some traveling engineers or what have you. It's just like with the outpost, the options you have to approach it are basically limitless. Whereas there's more you can do to a dungeon. Do you sneak in a day or do you sneak in at night? How much of like watching their guard and what have you do you do before you assault it and go on to try to attack it. And so yeah, these hooks, I always try to either have them lead into an outpost and or lead into a dungeon and or lead into a series of encounters that they are going to come up against. And my last one, the road encounters. These are just like my totally open, like these can basically just happen anywhere, anytime. Yeah, these are sort of, you can think about them as like filler encounters in that they can just fill up time, no matter what the context or circumstances. But I always try to have these like lead into something else. um okay, so yeah, dungeon outpost, if it's gonna be more than 2 hours, like a dungeon, it can really take up a lot of time. And usually these will always feel like a good, complete story, in that there's like going to be that beginning, the how do you deal with this, like what method do you want to take to approach this, that sort of like setup, and then there's going to be the meat of it, and you going in and trying to enact your plan, and then there's always going to be some sort of final boss type conclusion at the end of the dungeon. And so if you don't have that dungeon and you don't have that like boss fight, you sort of have to come up with some sort of alternative for it. And generally, if I have like a less than 2 hour session, if I have to choose between, like, I could have three very short encounters, or I could have like one long dramatic encounter, I will generally err towards the side of having one like big climax of an encounter rather than a couple of short ones. Obviously, you always gotta change it up. You always gotta like, you can't ever let the players catch on to the formula. You always got to do a little bit of everything. Um, but my means of like making a regular random road encounter into a climatic encounter is basically just by like stapling two encounters together. You start with them coming across orcs on the road and they're fighting them, and then you have to figure out a way to escalate that encounter. And this might be the owl bear bursting out of the woods and then attacking the players. And that, I find, like, if you have something that doesn't necessarily lead into anything else, I wouldn't necessarily think of that owl bear bursting out of the woods as a one-dimensional encounter. I would think about it, or I would consider that like a two-dimensional encounter, in that like the thing that it is like providing to the story is the fact that it is like greatly raising the tension of this combat encounter. Um, and yeah, once like the players are taking damage, getting low, everything is obviously just going to become a lot more tense. And just like, you know, even if you are just doing three short encounters, like if multiple players are like at 1 HP or low HP, like even just a band of a couple of goblins are now becoming this great threat because they can start just dropping players to zero with just a single hit, a single attack. And so, in that sense, they're kind of just becoming a boss fight in and of themselves. And okay, so that's what I've got for, trying to make things dramatic towards the end of a session. Now, session cohesion. This is the really important part, and this is probably like the hardest part. And this is really where your improv skills are going to be tested the most. Is I've found that I had this problem even though I was just straight up like preparing my sessions. Is This is something that I don't think I gave its worth of like consideration fully. Is that you really don't want to end up in a situation where you just say this occurs and then this occurs and then this occurs and then this occurs and then this occurs. You really, really want to have your players, you are starting to do this thing, therefore you go over here. But when you go over here, another thing occurs to you. You run into bandits, therefore you must now do this. And now you're trying to kill these bandits, but the owl bear pops out of the woods. Something along those lines. Maybe you're the king is offering you 100 gold to kill this bugbear. Therefore, you head out to kill this bugbear that's been robbing peasants. But on your way to the bugbear, you encounter bandits. So therefore, you try to deal with the bandits, but you find out that they are of a rival gang of the bugbear, and they offer they offer their help in taking out this bugbear because he's bad for business. Therefore, you team up with the bandits, but they betray you, and when you guys are at your weakest, and they try to stab you in the back, so on and so forth. Um, which I find it's difficult to try to write a session with these things in mind, because how you can't tell if the players are going to work alongside those bandits, maybe they will just, uh, say like, screw these bandits, we're just gonna kill them. And now you don't have that. Now that you don't have that, therefore they work alongside the bandits. Now that you have the, therefore these bandits are bad people, so they try to kill them, and now you've just lost that, your next step in the process. So this is much more of a thing that you have to be considering of with each action and each thing that your players are doing. Like, how do you lead the next? How do you connect these next things? The therefores are usually like the logical thing. Like the players have this information, and this is what we are doing with that information. This is the, you know like, so then, to use a more conversationalist term, like, the players have this set out in front of them, so then they do this, and then your buts are sort of just the and thens. These are just sort of your, like, just a thing occurs. uh this is just a dramatic stake that is raised, and a challenge or an encounter, an obstacle that prevents, or that in some way gets in the way of the players trying to do their thing. Um, so, multiple, like, logical things. Like, they have this information, so then they do this, so then they do this, so then they do this. I find that that's totally okay, but if you start going back to multiple, but then this, but then this, but then this, but then this, you start wrapping back around to just things, and then this, and then this, and then this occurring. So you want to avoid having any more of one but in between each therefore, and a sense of terms of like the things that are happening in this session. My last thing that I wanted to always try to include to make a session feel like a complete story is try to have some element of a setup, a reminder, and a payoff over the course of one session. And like, I find if you can include one of these, it will make your session feel quite intentional. Like, it won't feel like an improv session. It'll come across as though this is something that has been written and prepared. If you can have either, possibly the the hook, that might be the setup. And then, if some merchant is hiring your services, and the reminder of, someone that works for the merchant or something related to the merchant comes up and interacts with the players to some extent, and a payoff of either some information being revealed about the merchant, or, this could be either a positive or negative thing to, that will affect the future of the players. Some kind of, this could be an NPC that is otherwise entirely unrelated. This could be entirely for like comedic effect, is having a player or having an NPC show up, and then like there is a hint possibly that that NPC is nearby, and then you can have that NPC save the players. Or reverse, maybe there is a hint of a certain NPC or character being nearby, and then they run into that NPC or player, or that NPC or creature or character or whatever, and then that NPC or creature might attack the players towards the end. This is sort of your way of like getting away with a Deus Ex Machina without making it seem, or I forget what the term. There's some like opposite of Deus Ex Machina, where it's just some contrived thing comes out of nowhere like to act as like a setback towards the player characters. Um, so this is your way of making either that Deus Ex Machina or that thing that is a setback towards the players. This is how you can have that occur without it seeming entirely contrived and just happening out of convenience for the story and actually seeming like, oh, this was intentional. Okay. So, yeah, that's the general process for how I want to construct an improv session as I'm playing it. Okay. So, this is my sort of final, not necessarily regarding to the structure of an improv session. This can be used for any type of preparedness in a session. But when interacting with NPCs, use less questions unless you are actively trying to like get the point across that they are being like interrogated. If there's guards like demanding answers for something that's happening, yeah, they might ask questions. But otherwise, if you're going for a more conversational tone or a more like of a back and forth dialogue, if a player makes or not a player, if a NPC makes an assumption about a player, that can actually give them more to work off of as when they answer that sort of prompt that's being given to them. So as opposed to saying asking, "Hey, where are you from?" and then the player sort of there are different ways that they could answer that, but like they're generally going to social contract and all that. You're sort of like leading them into this one answer of answering with where they're from, presumably. But if the NPC instead says like, well, you look like you are from beyond the mountains, then you can you're either learning something about your well, for one, you're adding a little bit of the world into the game. The players might either follow up on that. Alternatively, the you might be learning something about this NPC and that they are making this type of assumption and that they have the knowledge and the context of like this kind of assumption that they're making. Or you're learning something about the character that is being, prompted with this, in that they are, that they have the appearance or this air about them that leads people to believe that they are from this location. So yeah, this is something I never really used in the past. It's something I heard in a tips video that I am now trying to share among more. But I think this is a great idea, and also, so yeah, that player might have different ways of answering. They might have like a sarcastic response. They might have a genuine response. They might get offended. They might take it as a compliment. Uh, they might either play along or it might be correct. It might be true, and they might be happy that this other person is aware of where they're from. Um, okay, yeah, it's just a lot more you can work with than just a question. And this is one that I really, really struggle with. Is like I definitely have this like feeling, I guess, that like whenever there is silence, I always um I always get sort of like nervous or anxious, and I just instantly want to fill it with something. But silence is actually like it's actually like a good thing when you either make a statement or ask a question or whatever, and instead of answering instantly, that which sort of leads you to believe that like they're just waiting for their turn to answer, that they were not listening to you. They're just coming up with what they already had in their head that they knew they were going to say, and they were just waiting for their turn. If they actually take a moment to come up with a response, then that means they're actually listening to you and thinking about what you're saying, and are then coming up with a response. And so, like, there's that sort of like anger management uh, tip where, like, whenever you feel yourself getting angry, you count to 10. Um, I find that that can sometimes be a good rule for, instead of instead of anger, for like when there is like a moment of silence, is just like give a quick like count to 10 in your head whenever you give like a statement that might require, like, a moment of thought for a response, to give them that chance to come up with something. And then if like more than 10 seconds pass and uh you think it's just time for something to continue, and like if you think they might be stuck or struggling or lost or whatever, you can sort of like help them out after that by continuing. But also, like, I find in like real life, I almost like never interrupt people, and for some reason I never have this problem in like real life day-to-day conversation. But as soon as it comes to like D&D, I like have this horrible problem of like interrupting people by just like starting to talk like whenever there's a moment of silence. So I think this is a really really big one I need to work on. And improving, it can be like nerve wracking because you can't really, it's something that you just got to do in the moment. It's not something you can start thinking about like beforehand, like, well, if they do this, then maybe this will happen, because that is just an infinite choose your own adventure story you're trying to play in your head right there, which is not to say entirely useless, but probably not, it's never going to solve everything, certainly. So you got to trust yourself. So with that, hopefully someone found something useful. I'll see you later. Goodbye.